Hi, and welcome to Alive with Chronic Illness, a podcast dedicated to exploring what it's like to live with and not in spite of chronic illness. Today I'm joined by Christine to explore working with chronic illness. Thank you for joining me today, Christine. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little about the work you do?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I'm honored to be with you on your program. So I'm Reverend Christine Vaughan Davies, and of course you can call me Christine. I primarily am the director of spiritual care at Robert Wood Johnson University Hospital. So we're a level 1 trauma hospital, and I run all of our hospital chaplaincy programs, which I can speak a little bit more about. I'm also a writer, and I work as a spiritual director where I work with individuals who are navigating how to be more spiritual within their own lives.
Brilliant. Thank you. So I remember you saying that you were epileptic.
Mm-hmm.
Does that play a role in the work you do?
Oh, absolutely. That's what brought me into the work that I do, actually. So I kind of, if you're okay with me sharing my full backstory, I grew up a pretty precocious kid and went to church a lot and really took to that and was convinced of God's presence at a young age, and also thought that God wanted me to help the most people possible. And I thought that the way that I could do that at the time was by becoming a medical doctor. And my mom's a nurse, so I think she kind of helped that dream along. And I did those things. I worked, or I volunteered to start as a candy striper back in hospitals where you had the red and white kind of uniform. And then I worked for a time as an ambulance, as an EMT, an ambulance worker, so emergency medical technician, where I was ensuring kind of safe passage with people to the hospital that were going through, an emergency medical crisis. And while I was doing that, it was really being in the backs of people in the ambulance and kind of holding their hand as they were trying to figure out, like, why is this happening to me? And they were just in pain and suffering. And as much as I could, give them oxygen and treat their minor wounds and wraps, it was really that space of just accompanying them when they were going through those intense moments that I found the most meaningful. And when I was about 16, 17, was going through medical issues of my own, was in and out of hospitals, went to provider after provider to try to figure out what was going on with me. I was getting really bad headaches. I was having these fainting spells, difficulty sleeping. And so many neurologists told me, oh, it's in your head. You have to go see a therapist. And looking back, it's outrageous. It was in my head, but it was epilepsy, and a simple EEG would have shown that, which it took a long time to get that diagnosis. And I found myself, especially in these hospitalizations, being really frustrated with the bedside manner that I was getting from the physicians. And it was around the same time that the church my family had been attending had a new associate pastor who, in between my hospital stints, just took me out to dinner and just talked to me about all that was going on for me and how it was impacting me emotionally and spiritually. And looking back, I'm like, oh, she was giving me spiritual care. And that's what I now do for others and teach, how to do that. And I found more healing in that than I did in, any of the medications. I mean, I take my medications dutifully, but it was more of acknowledging me as a holistic person. And that really led me in the path that I'm in now, to try to be that comforting presence to others who are going through something that they're going to have all sorts of reactions to.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you touched on there, that it's so often that people will hear from doctors, oh, it's in your head, because they're missing what the cause is. And it just really can feel very devaluing from that perspective. So having someone who listens to you and sees you as a full person rather than just this one thing is really positive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's so much, I refer to it as medical gaslighting
Yeah.
that can go on. It's awkward because I also work for a hospital. But I tell patients, I'm like, you know yourself better than anyone else, right? And so if something is off for you and you know that, hold on to that. because it is so easy to, assume that the authorities know everything and that their answer is the exact truth. When, there is a lot of guesswork that goes on in medicine, and people present very differently, and symptoms present differently, and there are always changes in terms of, how we're diagnosing things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that empowerment, I'm sure that has a significant impact, having somebody like yourself saying to them, it's okay, you know your body better and you can raise these questions. And do you find that, generally speaking, when you're speaking with people and you're sort of trying to empower them, that it really helps them take that step to actually ask again and say, look, no, I am experiencing this and I need some support?
Mhm. I think so. And sometimes I'll offer, especially if I can get the sense that someone's especially nervous, sometimes I'll offer to be with them when they're speaking to their physician. That doesn't happen all the time. And, it doesn't always line up with our schedules to allow for that. But if I happen to be, at a patient's bedside, and they're stressing some of these concerns, or often they have a lot of questions that they want to ask their doctor, but they might be afraid to, or just feel in the moment too shy to ask. And so sometimes just being able to support them in that way, so that they can have that really ongoing relationship that's going to hopefully lead to healing for them.
So are you based at the hospital full time?
I am, yes. So I'm full time at the hospital, and I also do teaching in seminaries as well as at the hospital about how to do the work of chaplaincy and how to do the work of spiritual care. And then on the side, I have my own practice where I meet with individuals one to one who are wanting support around figuring out their spirituality and whatever that looks like for them.
So you're a very busy schedule then.
I am, yeah, and I have kids and a farm and all sorts of fun stuff. But I do like to keep busy.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, I can tell. So I guess that you touched on there a little bit, but I'm kind of interested to know for patients who maybe listen to this or people who are in hospital right now or people who are going into hospital, do you have any sort of advice or guidance on how to manage, I guess, the complexity of emotions that come alongside having procedures, having prolonged hospital stays?
Yeah, so I think the first is to name what those emotions are, and it's going to be varied for different individuals, right? So I know for myself, when I finally got my diagnosis of epilepsy, to me, that was a relief because I was starting to think that, maybe this isn't real. Maybe I am, making it up or in some way. And so for me, it was great. I'm like, yes, now we have a plan. We know what this is. Like, I'll take, all the meds, and, it's been bumpy since then, of course, as I've had seizures, but at least in that moment, I had relief. That's not going to be the case for everyone. A diagnosis doesn't always bring relief, right? Especially if someone is undergoing, a cancer diagnosis, that's going to bring all sorts of emotions. And so I would say just notice what you're feeling. It could be fear of what the treatment might do, fear of, that your life may not be as expected. This is going to maybe change the course of what you're expecting your life to be. Certainly sadness. A lot of people that I sit with in the hospital, I hear voice the question of why. Why is this happening to me? Our term that we use for that is existential meaning making, right? We're trying to figure out what is the reason for this. So someone, who just got diagnosed with lung cancer says to me, I never smoked a day in my life. I don't understand why. And sometimes patients tell me, like, if I only knew why, then I could, understand this and wrap my head around it. And we often don't know the reasons, even for, a condition that is genetic, or there can be, a real logical conclusion as to the source. Why questioning is still important, because it is that giving voice to the lament. So I think there's a lot of sorrow and anguish and sometimes anger that comes into that why. So I would allow yourself to have it. Sometimes I hear a lot of people that are whying or really angry at God, right? If they are of a religion that believes in a God, and that, God has control over things, people might be angry at God. Sometimes people are angry at the doctors. Sometimes people are angry at the universe. Just be with whatever is going on for you, and know that that is normal. And I would also suggest reaching out so that you're not isolated in these feelings. So of course, if you're in a hospital, I'm hoping they have a hospital chaplain. Not all hospitals do. I think they should, but I'm biased. But yeah, ask if there's a chaplain you can reach out to. Some hospitals, the social workers get to do more of the one-on-one counseling. Some they're doing, more discharge planning and case management. But see what resources are currently at play for you, where you are, and then don't be afraid to reach beyond that. Right. So having some honest conversations with friends and family. I know that can be tricky at times because sometimes our families or our friends don't want us to hear or don't want to hear that we're struggling with something. They say, oh no, you have to be brave, you have to fight this, but because they want what's best for us, and so it's hard for them to hear. But I would invite you to think about the people that you can truly be yourself with. The great news now is that there's so many online support groups as well. So sometimes sometimes I need to talk to other people with epilepsy who get it, who understand what it's going through. Or there's podcasts that, it's a one way, but I can still listen to what people's experiences are and say, oh yeah, that was just like mine. And so I think that helps us to not feel alone in those moments.
Yeah, absolutely. And like what you touched on there about the online communities, they can just be amazing, especially if you're looking to talk to someone that can relate to how you're feeling, who might have the same condition. I think that can really help with the isolation that sometimes comes with chronic illness. I think you really touched on some really interesting points there, particularly around like anger and feeling your feelings. I think that's really powerful to give yourself permission to feel whatever it is that you're feeling, and that's okay.
Yeah, and sometimes I think if we can name it, we can tame it, right? So sometimes if I don't know what I'm feeling, that it feels overwhelming, right? But if I can say, oh, I'm really angry that this medication is not working, right? That makes it so much clearer to know how to work with that anger. Okay, now we're going to come up with a plan. What other medications might there be that might work better, and really trying to identify it versus not knowing what's going on and letting it spill into all aspects of my life.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think when you've got that power of taking that back and saying, this is what I'm feeling and this is why, and this is what I'm going to do about it, that really helps you move forward in a positive way, hopefully more effective solutions. I know that it's difficult with medications to get ones that work and get ones that don't have, I
Oh my
guess,
goodness, it's such a journey.
Yeah. I guess
And
have
then
you
you have the side
experienced that?
effects, and yeah.
Yeah, have you experienced that yourself of your journey?
Oh my goodness. Yes, I think I have probably been on 20 different medications for my epilepsy alone. And then of course those medications, don't work with other medications as well that I may be on for any number of things. And then they'll stop working after a time. So yeah, that is a huge source of frustration for me, and one that is hard to predict because, as I said before, knowing that everybody is different, and so medications are going to work differently for different people. And I have found too that the side effects for me are sometimes worse than the medication themselves. When I was first diagnosed at 17, the medication I was on, made me gain, oh gosh, I must have gained about 80 to 100 pounds and made all my hair fall out. And I was 17. That was miserable. There's, lots more since then, but yeah, certainly having seizures is worse. So I will, take my medication every day for that reason. But there are, unintended things that we don't even think about necessarily unless you're on that chronic journey condition for yourself. Anytime I get a headache, I'm like, okay, is this a seizure? Is this a migraine? Is this I didn't drink enough water? And so it's really having to investigate, all of yourself and take good care of all of yourself. For me, a major trigger is sleep. And you heard how I like to keep busy. So sometimes my sleep suffers, but really having to make that a priority, be as physically active as I can, knowing that that's going to help, my mood, and that will help me to sleep. So it does sometimes feel, at least my experience of living and working with chronic illness, is that it can be a bit of a jigsaw puzzle, making sure that all the pieces will fit as nicely as possible. And sometimes they just don't fit. And it has encouraged me to be more vulnerable with people in my life, telling them what's going on. Anytime I get a new group of students that I'm teaching in class, I will start by telling them, look, I have epilepsy, and I'm telling you for two reasons. One is if I have a seizure, I need you to know what to do. And then the other is because it brought me into this work, and I believe in the importance of vulnerability. and wanting them to really investigate what brought them into this work. And if they sit with a patient that has epilepsy, hopefully they'll have a little bit more background, having heard some of my story, so they can be with that patient a little bit better.
Yeah, I think that definitely brings that personal element to it and that you're willing to be vulnerable. Especially as you said, you expect like, or you would encourage vulnerability from them as well. So showing that yourself just really, it makes it feel like it's a comfortable, safe space to be vulnerable, to explore the reasons why and what has brought you into the work. And I guess that kind of feeds into, as you've said, like it was a massive part, like epilepsy in that journey. And how do you find do you find that your work you do now, I guess I don't know if the right word is to kind of say gives a purpose to the epilepsy, because I don't know if that's what I want to say, but what I mean is like, does it, I don't know. Does
No,
it?
it does. I understand what you're getting at. It absolutely does for me. It helps to, uh, it's a way in which that I've made meaning of this thing that has happened to me, right? Which, I don't necessarily wish upon other people, but I'm fortunate in that mine is well managed at this point in time. But absolutely, I think it helped lead me to my purpose, and made me more sensitive, more empathetic, in ways that I might not have been otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's the same for myself. I think the line of work I've gone into, I've been working in health and social care sector for over 10 years, and my health was definitely a massive part of that. And it enabled me to really have an empathy for the people I was working with because I understood on a level of what they're going through because of that shared experience of living with like unpredictable chronic illnesses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sometimes there's the type of thing that only people that have experienced it can really understand. Now, I've not experienced every, condition under the sun, but what I teach my students a lot is it's called use of self, versus self-disclosure. So, for instance, if I happen to be with a patient who maybe also has epilepsy, right? I don't typically disclose that I do, but I might think to myself, okay, they might be fearful, right? Because I know that sometimes I feel like a ticking time bomb that I never know when I may have a seizure, right? So I wonder if they're feeling fearful right now. So I may say, what are you feeling in this moment? Do you have any fear? And that's my way of using my experience to help connect with them without just telling my story. I think a lot of times people think about, oh, we just tell our story and that's how we connect. That's one way of connecting, but there's more effective ways when we're doing this, as a profession. And so, even if I'm sitting with someone that I do also sit with a lot of grief and loss, and it's the type of environment where I know what it is to be out of control, right? And not have control over something and lament that something is going on in my life. And so being able to connect with others through that, I think is very powerful and giving space for them to have that voice.
I think, like you said, there it informs your practice rather than necessarily having to be like you sharing that you have epilepsy as well. If it was somebody, for example, you can sort of use that to inform everything that you do in your work, that empathy, that understanding, that perspective.
Yes, absolutely. Now, I don't mind sharing on podcasts because I do think it's also important for people to be out there if they're open to it, with what's going on with them. Because before I got diagnosed, I didn't know anyone with epilepsy, and it turns out it's quite common. 1 in 26 individuals have it, and I don't know that many people with it, but I do think it's important to name, and especially as it can reduce stigma, because I think that accompanies a lot of these chronic conditions for us.
Yeah, and I think from that stigma, you can really get like a fear of things, and it might maybe mean
Absolutely.
that you don't go and try and get your diagnosis as soon as you would.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Or, it may be a fear of, I've heard a lot of people talk about, fear of getting fired and, or being treated differently. And I think that that is all very valid. I like to think that in this day and age, we're a little bit better around that. And especially some of the rights that are afforded to people with disabilities, but it is still a very, real thing.
I hear that a lot, and I work with people a lot who have struggled in sort of like traditional employment, have looked into sort of self-employment as a way of finding or actually creating work for themselves, which I think is always just so amazing when you meet these people and they've created their own work. But there is still a lot of fear around how will it be perceived in the workplace? How will conditions be perceived? Will you be perceived as less capable, even though it doesn't impact your capability?
Right. I mean, something as silly as when I was a teenager and first got diagnosed, I was a lifeguard. I got fired from my lifeguard job. And I said, "You're not allowed to do that. That's illegal." They said, "Well, we don't want you having a seizure while you're lifeguarding." I'm like, "Well, anyone can have any sort of medical event while they're doing any sort of work." And again, it was a summer job. It was not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of my life, but that small example can be manifold, especially as I do know some people that have had seizures at work and what that's done for them. I sometimes worry now. I mean, I live a fair distance from my hospital. And I do try to work remote when possible, because if I have a seizure, I can't drive. And like I said, fortunately, I have been seizure free for a number of years. But that's something that's always going on in the back of my mind. So as you said, knowing people that have carved out their own way of working and had that entrepreneurial spirit, I think is usually born out of necessity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess like what you were saying there, like you have to think to yourself, I want to work as remotely as possible just in case. So you're always kind of thinking, how can I adapt this if something was to change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, COVID made that a reality for a lot of us in a lot of different ways. Although I was working still in person during that time, being in the hospital. Um, but I do think that helped level the playing field in some way.
Yeah. Do you think that any of the work that you do now, do you do things a little bit more remotely since the pandemic?
Yes and no. Uh, I certainly do more individual work remotely. So I do have a beautiful office where maybe one day we'll see people, face to face for my individual spiritual direction practice. But right now, everyone prefers remote, and I think that's been the case since COVID. Even people that are not that far away from me geographically, it's just more convenient. To not have to get in the car or drive or have a commute, and because there can be that deep connection, just seeing people online.
Yeah. And I guess you get to connect with people from all over the world. It really offers that flexibility and maybe people you wouldn't have had the opportunity to connect with otherwise.
Yes, that is a neat thing. Like you and me, different parts of the world right now, and getting to have a conversation about these important things.
And do you find like a lot of people come to you who are experiencing chronic illnesses and maybe trying to sort of find meaning in it?
Yes, yes, I see that a lot, especially um, if they maybe are religious or maybe spiritual, and really trying to figure out how this works with their spirituality. So I like to define spirituality very quickly in three different ways. We connect with ourselves. So spirituality, one way is connection with selves. One way is connection with others or community. And then another part of it is connection with the divine or transcendent. So connection for ourselves can be easily severed when we are not feeling ourselves and not feeling, healthy and whole, or that something is just off, right? So certainly when I was going through my initial diagnosis, or even now, if I've had, an event, I feel discombobulated, right? I don't feel like I can, even trust my body to do that which it needs to do. So that is a source of disconnection, which can impact one's spirituality. Community, we all kind of saw that during COVID, not being in the physical presence of others can certainly impact people. Or, as we talked about before, the isolation that people with chronic illness sometimes have, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of self-selection, can lead to breaking off with other people. And so that can also lead to some spiritual distress. And then lastly, connection with the divine or the transcendent. For some people, that might be God. For some people, that might be, more of the universe or nature. And there's times when we're struggling to make meaning of, why is this happening to me? What am I going through? Like I said before, like the anger at God can be there, or wishing that we understood something a little bit more so we can kind of wrap our heads around it. But the meaning making process can take years, to really figure out. And sometimes even then, like we talked about earlier, like, yes, I do believe my profession is a direct result of my illness. But that took me a long time. As I was going through it, that was not the case. We're talking, 30 years here. So, yeah, it's really looking back at, okay, where else have you made meaning in your life of events that have happened? And sometimes that can be a clue, but a lot of it is just being patient with ourselves as things unfold, and attending to those feelings, as we talked about before, finding support in the community, whatever that might look like for someone. All of those things I think are really helpful, and having someone that's going to be a listening presence as you're kind of sorting through these intense issues.
Yeah, and providing that space to feel those feelings so that they're in a safe
Mm-hmm.
space with you to work through that.
Yes, I like to think so, that I can create a safe space for individuals to be able to, speak what's on their heart when that's not always a possibility in a lot of settings.
Yeah, and I think it is that kind of that support. At least like from my experience of being different diagnoses, you go to the doctors, you have your test, you might go to an appointment and they say this is what you've got, and then you just leave and that's it. You're just sort of in that moment, you're like completely on your own. There is not like here's a list of places you can go and someone can help you kind of make sense of it. You feel quite lost, I think, a lot of the time. Like I've been disabled my whole life, but every time I get a new diagnosis, I feel that same like, oh, what now? Where do I go now?
Absolutely. It's like, sometimes if you're lucky, you get a pamphlet and that's it. And we're all Googling and trying to figure things out, but we're scared. We don't know what it is. Yeah, it can be completely overwhelming to navigate through that. And, even as we get some answers around it, like we talked about before, those feelings are still there. And then I think there's an element to, the more that we get diagnosed with, I find is, at least for me, it's like, oh, now I have this. Like I thought it was bad before, and now I have this. And how is this going to now interact with this? And and I think that especially someone that, for instance, I'm going through menopause right now, and I'm like, okay, like now I got to battle this on top of figuring out the epilepsy, on top of figuring out thyroid issues, and it just can feel like it's one more thing, and it can be overwhelming. And so, really trying to help people find their own power, their own resilience to be able to chart a course forward.
Yeah, like when you get that extra diagnosis and it's like another thing you've got to kind of manage, and you might have felt like, oh, I've just made sense of this first one. Now I've got this. And what does that mean? And how do I feel as a person now that I'm navigating so many different things?
Yeah, and holding them all together, and also knowing that we are not just our diagnoses, right? Like we are, we as Whitman says, contain multitudes, and some of it are strands of that, but there's plenty of other things as well, which can also lead to that overwhelm, right? So it's like, oh, how do I parent when I'm postictal after a seizure, or how do I continue working when I'm having to change medications and having to do, a 5-day EEG sleep study, and those types of things.
Yeah, and I think that can be like quite scary in itself, sort of that, well, at least from my own experience, a bit of a thought of, okay, like obviously I had the symptoms for a while when I get diagnosed, but like, how do I navigate my life moving forward? And almost a thought of predicting the future. I'm terrible at that. I shouldn't try and do that, but oh, what if it gets worse? How am I going to be able to do this if it gets worse? Before it
Yeah,
gets,
no,
I'm already
we
worrying.
we all do that, right? It's
Yeah.
it's this, wanting to have this fallacy of control, and yet sometimes it's knowing that, if and when the worst thing happens, like we'll handle it, right? And sometimes the barring worry toward that thing, I've learned this the hard way, doesn't actually help me prepare for it. It may, I may cheat myself into thinking, oh, this is going to help if I think through all these, catastrophes. But really, it's about knowing that, okay, whatever comes up, like I will handle it at that moment.
Yeah, and I think that's the most powerful way. It's sort of like I will take this one day at a time and it's some 1 minute at a time sometimes when it's quite hard and it's a difficult when you're going through something, a big change. I think it's sort of I can handle this. I have the strength to do this. I've been doing this. I found
Mhm.
that powerful myself, just sort of thinking in those moments of overwhelm, like I can't do this, but then actually realizing that I've been doing it for the last 10 minutes. I can do this.
hmm Yeah, and this is where the practice of mindfulness can really come in. And some of my clients that I see in my practice that have chronic pain, and sometimes without knowing where it's coming from. Sometimes they know, but it's really about, okay, what can I do, or what can I feel in this very moment, right? In this moment, I can be grateful for X, Y, and Z. I'm not going to worry about the doctor's appointment next week. I'm going to focus on doing a breathing exercise right now and today. And as much as I also in my other line of work want people to be prepared, and I do a lot of advanced care planning and living wills and things of that nature and healthcare proxies, we have to balance it out, right? We have to focus also on really that mindfulness that can help us to be in tune with who we are in this particular moment.
Yeah, really, I guess thinking about the future, planning for the future, while still making space for what's happening right now.
Yeah, it's quite a duality to hold on to that.
Yeah, but yeah, I think it does help. I think just sort of being able to be present in the moment, and particularly in those like the happy moments when you're going through a difficult time, and holding on to those moments and thinking about, I guess the small things, I guess, mean a lot more to me now than they have when my health was like in a better place. I didn't really take the time to stop and be in nature as much as I do now. And it's kind of, I guess, something that I hold on to. I think, wow, this is such a happy space for me. And I remember that when things are tough, I'm like, yeah, but I was happy yesterday in that field with those beautiful cows, and I can be happy again. It's just a difficult time right now.
Yeah, sometimes remembering that things are a season
Yeah.
and won't always be this hard, I think can be incredibly important. I also sometimes recommend to people to try a mini gratitude practice, which when we are not feeling ourselves or we're in a lot of pain, like that is not the time that we're usually thankful for things, or at least I'm not. But a mini gratitude practice, you can try to find, I say anywhere from 1 to 3 things a day that you are grateful for that day. And I say mini, like try to make it as micro as possible. Often when you ask people what are they grateful for, they'll say, "Oh, my family or my home," or like no. We know those things. Take something very, very small, right? Like so, today I might be grateful for the fact that my air conditioning is working because it is very hot where I am living. Or I might be grateful that I am able to, be on this podcast with you and was able to create the space in my day. I may be grateful for the fact that, I had some cucumber in my water, in ice water today, and it just tasted very crisp and great. So really small things that even when life is feeling out of control and we are feeling overwhelmed, if you can point to 3 very small things that you can be grateful for, that helps to, there's all sorts of research that backs this up, that helps to change our mindset and our orientation and can lead us into a path of resilience.
I love that. And yeah, I agree. I think building the resilience is so important, such a massive tool to have when you're facing lots of difficult and often very scary things at once. So yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, that's amazing. As we're coming up to the end, I was wondering if you have any kind of like, I guess it's going to be hard to narrow it down to one sometimes, but is there any advice you would give to anyone listening who's maybe thinking, how am I going to be able to work well with my chronic illness or perhaps find my purpose?
Yeah, so I think sometimes we have to find a new normal for ourselves. So what we're doing when we're going through a chronic illness and something that is so life-changing is that there is an element of like loss and grief there, right? So I would encourage people to give themselves time to name those feelings, to grieve that grief of their life changing beyond what they thought it was going to be. And then to reach out and to get some support and to know that you do not have to do this alone. And it is going to be easier to bear if you have others who are holding this with you and for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Those people around you that carry some of that weight. And thank you so much for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
Yes, it's lovely to get to chat with you.
Yeah, thank you.